Today on the Perception and Action podcast, my interview with Zoe Wimshurst from Performance Vision. How can we train athletes to improve their task-relevant vision capacities and connect that with their skill on the field? So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Before we get to today's topic, I want to tell you about my new book, Learning to Optimize Movement: Harnessing the Power of the Athlete-Environment Relationship, available now on Amazon in paperback and ebook formats. This book is the follow-up to my best-selling skill acquisition book, How We Learn to Move. In it, I discuss how we can go beyond learning basic coordination to becoming an elite mover, evidence-based principles for learning and coaching optimal movement. Take your game from proficiency to mastery. Now on to the show. Okay, so today on the podcast, it's my pleasure to be joined by Zoe Wimshurst. Thank you for joining me, Zoe.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here, Rob.
Yeah, no, so I think we were talking before. We've kind of known about each other's work for quite a long time. The first time we've had a chance to talk to each other, so it's really nice. So to start off with, can you tell us a bit about your background and how you got into what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we start off quite a long way back. So I'm a field hockey player. When I was younger, I was really good. Now I just struggle around. But I did a lot of like the junior international stuff. And I kind of, through that, I saw a sports psychologist for the first time, which back in those days was quite a rare thing. And I thought, oh, this looks really good. I'm really interested in sports psychology. You know, to me at that time, it seemed like they got to sit around and watch a lot of sport and just chat to people. It seemed like the ideal career path. So from that was maybe when I was about 13 or 14. So from there, I kind of had set in my mind that I wanted to study sports psychology. And again, in those days, you couldn't study sports psychology as an undergraduate degree. So I went to university and studied psychology. And when I was doing that, I quickly realized that actually the more counseling side of things, the more qualitative questionnaire-based things were not what interested me. I was really interested in the experimental side, what it is that separates experts from novices. What can you do to make people more expert at their sports performance? And I was really fortunate that whilst I was studying, this was at the University of Surrey in the UK, they got an eye tracker for the first time. So I was one of the first people within the university to do my undergraduate dissertation using an eye tracker, an old desk-mounted one, to assess where field hockey goalkeepers were looking when they tried to save a penalty. And that kind of got me the bug for the vision side of things more and more. So I went on to Loughborough University to do my MSc in sports psychology. But again, my dissertation focused on the differences in where elite athletes were looking as opposed to novices. And in that study, I looked at kind of blocking out areas of the body where people would pick up cues from rather than eye tracking, just because I didn't have access to an eye tracker back then. So it was the best I could do. And then I returned to Surrey University to do my PhD. And I joined with no real idea of what I wanted to do beyond something to do with perception and expertise. And one of the reasons that Surrey invited me back was because they had an MRI scanner, an fMRI, and they had lots of research going on with people at the kind of with deficits in their abilities or behavior. And they thought that maybe the research I was doing could expand to the other end of the spectrum. So one of my PhD studies had to involve an fMRI, which was really challenging but interesting. So my PhD focused around vision in elite performers. There were 5 different studies within it, so quite a lot. And one of those was an fMRI study.
Okay.
While I was doing my PhD, I had a random phone call one day from Sir Clive Woodward, who over in the UK. He's a big name. He was the
even I know that one. Yeah.
He was the head coach of our rugby union team when we won the World Cup back in 2003. And at this time, he'd just become head of the British Olympic Association. And obviously, if Clive Woodward says he's calling you, you don't believe it. You think it's one of your friends messing around with you. But it turns out it was him. At the time, I was doing some work with the Great Britain men's hockey team for one of my PhD studies. I was fortunate enough to have had a contact that led to one thing and another, and I was working with them in the build-up to the Beijing Olympics. And that formed the basis of one of the studies of my PhD. And then Sir Clive got in contact and was really interested to find someone actually working hands-on with athletes. And so he ended up funding the rest of my PhD. I went part-time so I could work at the Olympic Association, which again gave me the fantastic opportunity to be able to reach out credibly to all British Olympic athletes at the time. So again, another one of my PhD studies involved a visual screening of around, it was 300 athletes, most of whom were Olympians at the time. So huge resources available to me through that, which I will forever be grateful for. During that time, so as I finished my PhD, I decided to set up my own company to try and keep going with the applied vision work, trying to help athletes reach their full potential in however that looked perception vision wise. And then once I'd graduated my PhD, I also took on an academic role, and I still work in academia. So I'm a senior lecturer at a small university called AECC University College, which is on the south coast of the UK. And I run my business Performance Vision, where I do my best to help elite athletes, or not just athletes, a few other ranges of people as well, but how their perception, and particularly the visual system, can help them achieve their full potential.
Oh, that's awesome.
Kind of it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's, the things that happen along the way, kind of random.
Yeah.
That's my career is full of those things. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't know what's going to take you where. And for me, it does seem to have been a series of random events, but I'm really grateful for the opportunities.
So the vision, so focus on the vision. You were doing screening. You're doing screening, I'm assuming, of a lot of kind of basic visual functions, acuity, convergence, a kind of a battery of tests. And are you kind of establishing a baseline or looking for maybe deficits? Can you tell us a little bit like the screening part of it? Yeah,
absolutely. So, back when I first started, I was screening everything that I could based on the equipment I could get my hands on. The way I work now is I tend to have an optician, an optometrist come along and do that side of the screening, because that's not my expertise. But the things I would look at, I used to call visual skills, but since listening to your talk in Finland, I'm now calling them visual capabilities. So they're kind of somewhere in between what the optometrist would look for and being slightly more sport specific. So there are things like catching off a reaction net, where I have a standardized procedure I would use, speed of eye movement, so reading off two eye charts side by side to see how quickly the eyes can move and focus, peripheral vision using a Vienna test system. So the purpose of it is to try and identify some baselines, so that if we're training, we can show that at least this capability is improving. I'm very wary that a lot of stuff in this field could potentially just be considered a placebo or a sham. And I really, really am against that and trying hard, but it's very difficult to provide some evidence for the improvements leading to on-pitch performance improvements as well. So the screening forms the basis of that, getting some control data. I'm not necessarily looking for deficits, but really early on, I found that I would write up reports for the coaches based on the screenings I had and make suggestions. So, for example, screen a rugby team, and then I can go back to the coaches and say, so based on the profile that I can see, it looks as though this player would struggle under a high ball, or something like that. And a lot of the time when I was working, I had no idea actually what these athletes could or couldn't do. But it turned out that the coaches really could see what I was getting at. And it's continued to be a real insight that coaches have really liked, because then just because there is a deficit doesn't mean it needs working on, because for that athlete, that skill might not be important to the way they play their game. Or it could be that they're pretty good at something, but the way they play, the style of play for them, if we could improve that a bit, it would improve their performance even further. So I'm very much against it's a deficit, therefore it must be improved, or it's pretty good, therefore we don't need to worry. It's about getting baselines and a picture of where people are at, and then working alongside the individual and the coaches to see, well, based on this, what do you think we should work on to really help your performance to its maximum?
Yeah, no, I really, really like that approach, connecting it kind of with the task itself, right? I'm sure it gets you a lot of, I'm sure, credibility when you can point out a problem that they're like, yeah, exactly. He actually does have that. But yeah, instead of the kind of approach like, their stereo acuity is lower than normal. Let's like show me that has anything to do with playing rugby first, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I really like that approach. And so you kind of identifying these kind of, this profile, then you kind of come up with a training program to focus on these and I know I was talking before we went on the air. I know you did a large training study. I think it's 2018, right? Where you and like you mentioned, the vision training field there's not a lot of good evidence for vision training benefits, but a large part of that is due to bad study design, right? So it's hard to know whether it's actually a null effect or a bad, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that many of the really early studies were carried out on novices in the sport. And you kind of think, well, why would training someone's vision help them be a better tennis player when they've never picked up a tennis racket before? Like, come on, there's a load more other things that need to happen first. And then you get all the studies where it's, okay, they're just training on the same task that you're testing them on. So there's no measurable improvement there. And the real difficulty that I find is actually showing that I can show, not relatively simply, I can bring about improvements in their visual performance, but why does that matter? It doesn't matter in terms of how they're going to perform on the pitch. And we need to work more on actually how we can get these things to translate to on-pitch performance and making a difference in how people are able to utilize these visual capabilities. And again, thinking about, I don't know how much your listeners know about the talk you gave at the conference in Finland, where you talked about action capabilities. And I think of visual capabilities in the same way. So if you improve the amount of weight that someone can lift, it doesn't necessarily translate into better performance. But if you then work on, it gives them more opportunities to perform in a different way. If they could lift a heavier weight, if they have better range of motion. And I think of visual capabilities in the same way. If I can improve someone's peripheral awareness and then work with them to utilize that peripheral awareness on the field, that's when you should see differences. So I don't expect one thing to automatically lead to the other. And that's, again, where many studies have gone wrong. You're missing that step where you try and integrate the improved capability into performance on the field. And it's difficult to do in the applied environment, particularly because coaches just want things done. They don't necessarily have, they might be super generous and give you an hour a week to work with some players one-on-one in a classroom somewhere. But then are you going to get the time during that vital on-pitch time, which is what's going to make all the difference? You need to get some really forward-thinking coaches to allow that to happen. But for me, that's where the difference is going to come from, is building one thing through into the other. Yeah,
I really like that. And like with peripheral awareness, right? I need to give you a task on the field where that helps, right? If you don't connect those dots, then the person's never, I think you kind of have to you're right, put it into the actual skill. And so, I think that's really, identifying things that are task relevant, and then, connecting them with the actual skill. And you're right, maybe it does nothing, but we won't know until. No. So I really like that approach. And I like, your study, you have, obviously another challenge in these is having the control groups. I sympathize. If you've never done a training study, then you don't do one. I would say they're really not fun. They're really, really important, but they're not fun, right?
Yeah. So an example. So my first ever published paper was one of my PhD studies, which was on the Olympic hockey team, field hockey team. And I was, fortunate enough to have access to them in the build up to the Beijing Olympics. So we did this kind of a training study with them where I trained them each week. And we tried to look for different metrics to show that there was an improvement on the field. So we looked at things like pass completion rates, goals scored. But, there's so many factors, both for that team and all their opponents in the build up to the Olympics. It was really difficult to find differences. So I was in discussions with my supervisor. I remember really clearly at my, and he's a brilliant guy, but he was very much a psychologist, not someone who was at that time, at least, very aware of the sports world. So he would just be like, well, you need a control group. If this is an Olympic hockey team, where am I going to find a match control group? Well, can't you just go to, the German team and just get them to do this pre and post testing? I was like, oh my goodness, head in my hands. So in the end, we had to look at comparing, we split the group into comparing kind of goalkeepers, midfielders, defenders to each other to look for improvements and changes, because it's just trying to find control groups at that level is so difficult, which is where the study that you're talking about, the cricket study. Yeah. Again, I was really fortunate enough to be with a county cricket team who had a coach who was really, really forward thinking and willing to allow me to split his squad into 4 different groups, one of which acted as a placebo control. So they didn't do nothing. They did extra cricket training, but we set it up in a way so that they thought it was a form of vision training, but really it was just the same sort of cricket drills they would have done anyway. It was effectively, just more cricket training. Yeah.
And so what was the vision training in that study?
So we actually had 3 different types of vision training. So we had practical vision training, which was them moving around doing things. So it involved things like using reaction nets to catch a ball, doing some things that seem really silly at the time, like trying to thread a strand of spaghetti through a straw to get that fine hand-eye coordination, juggling whilst kicking a ball against a wall. There were progressions. They did the training off the top of my head, it was over 6 weeks, and we progressed things on every 2 weeks for them. So they were kind of constantly moving forward. So the practical vision training was things like that. We also had a group who did an online vision training program. So one of these pre-designed computer-based training programs, which is supposed to enhance your vision. And then I also selected some games on the Nintendo Wii, which was the most interactive computer game of the time. So I selected some games like Mario and Sonic at the Olympics. There are a couple of others where you have to physically make a response to what you're seeing on the screen. And I thought, do you know what? If anything's going to train your vision on a computer, I don't see why that would be any different. So we used that as well and had some really interesting results. So we found that all 3 of these vision training groups, even though one was just playing a Nintendo Wii, improved the skills of the cricket players in basic cricket skills more than the group who were doing extra cricket training. So playing the Nintendo Wii for this period of time each week caused a greater improvement in cricket-related skills than additional cricket training did, which I was not expecting at all. I don't think anyone was, but it was really fascinating to see. And our the practical training group, so those that were more physically active using real balls and things like that, improved the most, although off the top of my head, I don't think they were significantly more than the 2 computer-based groups. And the 2 computer-based groups were very, very similar in the differences that they found.
Yeah. No. I think it's really interesting, and I like you also did the really important step of kind of measuring the processes, right? So you measured how their vision function changed.
Yeah.
Right. I think they always cite the Abernathy and Wood study as having the checklist of how to do a good training, and I think you did that. So it's a really interesting, and I think the important point that I've kind of come to grips with, like obviously. Training in cricket is best when you have a real bowler and a real field and a real ball, but we can't do that all the time, right?
No, we particularly, cricket is a sport where the physicality for a bowler is so extreme. It's so difficult. And there's been lots of different things tried using bowling machines and fancy bowling machines with projectors involved and things like that. And it's working out what's going to work best and what will bring about gains when you can't be in those situations, which are the ideal. And I'm never going to argue that playing the game is the best training for the game, but that's not practical in many different sports for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, no, I think it's right. I think, you could take the really hard line view and say, no, that's all garbage, not real cricket. It's not. But then, people are going to do it, right? People will want to train away by themselves when they're not. So let's try to find the things that are likely to be the best, right? I think, it's a reality. People are going to do it, right? And so how can we make it more representative and something that's likely more task relevant? I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I think, again, that's part of my aim, is to make sure that we are offering the best alternatives to people who want to do other things. The same way, surely the best way to improve agility for a soccer player is to get them playing more so it's in a match situation. But we still see 99.9% of everyone who plays football, soccer, going and doing some sprint training, some weight training, some things to improve those physical side of things. And I think that the vision should be treated in the same way. We know what the ideal is, but there are other things that can be done, which it seems as though can bring about some improvements.
Yeah. And I think it's also kind of focusing, training. Like, sometimes the actual game things are not the best for like peripheral vision. How many opportunities are there going to be to receive like there's not much exposure to that one thing when you're actually playing. To actually over a long time you'll get better, but it's not optimal for training that one thing, right? So yeah,
definitely. And again, I think that's the same across a lot of different things. You want to improve a basic skill of a hockey player, so know that someone can't hit the ball very hard. Just putting them in a game isn't going to make them hit it harder, because they'll find ways to just utilize the skills that they've got. And if they're currently not very good at one thing, they just might not use it. So yeah, it's about manipulating things so that actually hitting is the best solution. And so that they then get to practice that over and over again in a way that is representative of the game, but that they work out for themselves that that's the best solution.
Yeah. No, I think that's really, really great. And I applaud you for trying to, raise the quality of this research in this area, because it's really a mess. A lot of it's been around for so long, but it's just kind of, it's really a struggle to try to make sense of it. I wanted to ask you about kind of your experience actually, being applied, putting it in. I know we were talking before, you wrote a paper with yourself and Emma Mosley, who was on the podcast a long time ago, and one other person, I can't remember the name.
Yeah, Emma Kavanagh,
And kind of how your experience actually getting in there and doing this kind of stuff. Yeah, has that been like? Kind of, obviously, it really helps when you have a backing of a high for person in leadership. But what's your experience being, actually getting with the team and doing this kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think a lot of it does come down to the buy-in from the people at the top, as you say. The case study, which we wrote up, so that's available I think it's in Case Studies in Sports Psychology, was a really interesting example. So we were just working with one individual athlete. So it was a motorsport athlete who I'd been approached by their coach, and for them, money was no particular object, and they just wanted to know, right, what can we do to make this driver progress through the levels. I think when we first started off working with them, they were in Formula 3, and they did progress through to the highest level. So I sat down and I thought, and obviously for me, vision training is what springs to mind, but I wanted to think about how to best integrate that with other factors that in motorsport would be vitally important. So Emma Mosley, if you obviously listen to the podcast with her, she's a specialist in heart rate variability and slow-paced breathing to control things like stress level. And there's a huge link between levels of stress and some of your visual abilities. So, for example, if you're stressed, your peripheral vision decreases hugely. And I've seen it. We did it with this driver when he was nice and relaxed, he had a peripheral vision of around 170 degrees. And when we made him stressed, his peripheral vision, his field decreased by over 30 degrees.
Wow.
So, and I've seen that in a number of different athletes as well from different sports. So if we can use something like slow paced breathing to control his emotional regulation, which in turn will then link to the vision, it all fits together. So that's why I asked Emma Mosley to be on board. And Emma Kavanagh is a really, really excellent sports psychologist in things like emotional regulation and the more traditional side of sports psychology, the managing of emotions, things like that you would expect. So the three of us worked together. And it was, if you read the case study, it's really interesting because the driver had very strong opinions. They started off seeming to buy into everything. They very quickly shut down the side of things where they had to really be introspective about themselves and really just wanted to focus on the things where they could come in, try and do some drills, exercises. It's almost as if in that scenario they wanted to tick a box rather than really and truly investing in it. So again, from my perspective, getting the driver into the simulator while they were wearing the eye tracker, I found in the first couple of sessions that we did some really interesting findings where on laps where they were doing their best times, he was looking different places to laps where he was doing less good times. Okay. So that's really interesting for me. And I wanted to explore that further in combination with thinking, okay, so if we can improve the speed that you can move and focus your eyes, how is that going to help you be able to potentially look from exiting one corner and finding the next breaking point more quickly? That was one of the things we wanted to work on. But again, he shut down quite quickly. He didn't want to do the stuff in the simulator. Okay. So I can advise all I want. This is the best way forward. But in that case, we had to go with what I felt was not the best options and just do more of the basic vision capability training and combined it with Emma Mosley stuff on heart rate variability. So we were able to see improvements. The driver qualitatively reported that he was implementing a lot of the stuff, that he felt some really good improvements. But in that case, we had to alter what we were doing based on what he was willing to do and put into it, which is really frustrating as an applied practitioner, where you can see all these ways that would be so good, but it's just kind of shut down. And that's just one example. So again, working different teams, so I worked a rugby for 8 seasons, a range of different coaches, had some really, really good input where some of the coaching staff would invite me to come to be part of their training sessions. So we would put stuff into play. So where do you want your teammates to be looking so that you know what you're seeing of the pitch is the same picture that they're getting, so you can trust each other that they're going to be seeing the same things as you. So we put things like that into place alongside the individual visual capabilities training and trying to put into practice that progress through from, we used to train on a squash court with them doing various different things through to in their skills training through to into match like play. So that was a really good example. But even then there would be some of the players would come and see me every time they had the opportunity to and would do everything they could. And some I would see for the screening at the beginning of the season and then wouldn't see again for the rest of the season. And we decided as a coaching group that we would let them go with that because it's kind of a waste of everyone's time if they don't buy into it. And so I felt in a way it was a shame I didn't get to show those players more of what could be achieved, but in the time available, we decided to use it in a different way.
Yeah, no, that's a really good, I know, and that's for people to kind of experience, so people know, and it's very similar to mine. You have to be very adaptable, and you know, you can't just go up and not everybody's going to do what you want. They don't, sometimes the conditions they told you would be are not, right? There's like 20 people there or something, you know? So yeah, you really kind of have to make adjustments and kind of fit what the person really wants. Did another thing that I've experienced, I wonder, some of the kind of stranger drills, like the spaghetti one, do people kind of balk at when it's really far from the sport? I've experienced that myself, Yeah.
Yes, I do find that. And some of them, so for example, I use a Brock string a lot of the time. So with beads, make the eyes, of course, useful to try and give them examples of when it has worked. So, for example, with that, I had a case study of a winger in rugby. So a big part of their job is catching a high ball that's been kicked at them from the other end of the pitch. And we had one player who, obviously an exceptional player, but he was really weak under the high ball. So through investigation, we managed to discover that he had a slight imbalance between his eyes. So I got the optometrist to fit him with the lowest prescription contact lens in just one eye. But then we did real intensive work using the Brock string to make sure that his eyes were then working together. They were coordinated with his brain, and we saw really rapid improvements in his ability under the high ball, because instead of it now hitting his chest and bouncing back out because he wasn't able to track it properly, now we'd coordinated everything, it fit. So the more I can build up a kind of a range of case studies like that to try and explain in the player's language. The easier then it is to get them to do stuff that might out of the box seem really strange to them.
Yeah, no, and I really like the task focus. Like you've identified a situation that they need to approve, a specific game situation, and a function that visual capability that might be related to that, and let's follow that route. I think it's way better than here's a whole broad range of things you can train with. So I really like that approach, and I think that's that's a way I found too. If you can connect it with something tangible in the game, I think it helps a lot.
I definitely think that helps, and I think for me, it's really important that I have obviously got a background in playing sport myself, which helps, but also accepting that it's really like I'm never going to be an expert in bobsleigh or canoe slalom or some of the sports I've gone into work with. I'm going to know everything, but actually working with the athletes and the coaches who are the experts in the sport to get them to, be the experts in the sport and guide what we're doing and what's important for them, instead of coming in and going, well, this is important to all athletes, so you all have to do this, because that's not going to get them on side. For me, it's not the best way forward. And that's going to help bring more of a negative kind of reputation to vision training, which is the last thing that I want to happen.
Yeah. No, a lot of the team I work with, you get to the coaches and they're I don't see the relevance of this because they're just doing this broad screening, giving this report that's not really connected to anything on the field, and they're like, what are we supposed to do with this? right.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great approach. The last thing I wanted to ask you about was your fMRI work. So I know you have a paper that you published looking at differences in brain function. You were doing field hockey players, right? Is that?
Yep. So looking at, again, I had easy access to lots of field hockey players. So that's what we used at the time. But I was really interested in whether being an expert in one sport means that your brain functions, in that sport, does your brain function differently to a novice? There'd been some research before that suggests it would. But what I was interested in was, does that mean that your brain will also function in that expert way in a sport that you're not familiar with?
Okay.
So really useful for things like talent identification. So we we had hockey players in the fMRI machine having to do just a prediction task, watching a clip of some hockey players running at them, making a pass. Where's the ball going? Very simple, standard kind of anticipation exercise. And then we had a control group do the same thing. And we did find that there were differences in the underlying brain function of the experts to the novices. And then what we did was we had the same participants do a very, very similar study activity, but looking at badminton. So no one in the study had any particular experience in badminton at all. And again, we were looking to see if there were any differences in the brain function. So suddenly should all the brain function be the same between the experts and novices because they are all equally experienced in badminton. But what we found was that there were differences in the brain function in badminton. So there were no behavioral differences. The expert hockey players were no better at the task than novices were, but it seemed like they were going about the task in a different way. So the way that they were trying to solve the problem of where the shuttle would be going was meaning they were using different parts of the brain to what the novices were, where there were no real differences in their brain function from hockey to badminton. So a really interesting study that I've never been able to follow up on because I don't have access to an fMRI anymore. But it was really, really interesting to do and to try and look into that area of things and see that potentially for those interested in talent identification is something that could mean that if you are an expert in one sport, potentially there's something cognitive that could be transferred across to make it more easy once you've been reasonable at one sport.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And what came to mind for me is, playing the sport is making you kind of pick up information about movement and different sorts of information, and that there's some similarities, right, between how you move to shoot a hockey ball, how you move. They're not identical. Obviously, there's some things, very specific things you need to actually know and return it. But there are some aspects of movement. I think it's kind of also maybe relevant for coaching too. Like I think to train people being able to pick up these things and, that from experience. But I thought that was really interesting. Yeah. So do you, having an FMRI, that's a challenge, being able to use an FMRI, having them lying around. So, I don't know how much is happening with kind of the brain. Every once in a while I hear people ask me, should we be using EEG or something to screen athletes? And I don't know if there's enough there really to or taking the whole team to an fMRI when you're scouting them is probably, I
don't think we're there yet. And again, I think that there are a lot of devices around where people are claiming that, I'm going to measure the brain activity when you're doing various different things. But really all they're measuring is something that you can change by opening or closing your eyes. And so I think, again, it's an area which is very open to the gimmick that many sports people unfortunately will just buy into because they're so desperate to be better at what they do, but there isn't necessarily the research there to support many of the things that are on the market, as opposed to an fMRI, which you can't do any real practical things in. You have to lie in a big steel tube. I think it's another area kind of you have to control for so much, right? So many other things, right? Opening your eyes, moving your head, changing the light level are all going to change the signal, right? Yeah. And besides what you were seeing in the field, right? So to tease apart sport-specific things, and some of those devices, you're just getting noise. You're just getting those, So I think that's a good point. So kind of end off. Can you tell us a little bit about where people can find more about your vision, your training, and your vision performance? So what you're doing? Yeah, absolutely. So I have my own website, which is performancevision.co.uk. And I'm also attempting to get better at social media. So I've just joined Instagram and I'm on there at Performance Vision Limited. And I'm on Twitter as Zoe Wimshurst. Okay. So do have a look, and I'm happy to chat to anyone. I'm really passionate about this area, both in the research to support the applied work, but the applied stuff is what I really love. So I love chatting to people about it. Yeah,
and as I said, I really like the approach you're using with it. So thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled. Gone straight